Okay. Before we start, I'm going to remind you of this because I don't want you to forget it or miss it. There is a ministerial determination with regard to guest accommodation that exists outside the planning scheme, but as we talked about probably 3 weeks ago, overrides the planning scheme potentially. So have a look at it. It's relevant. It's not on Council's website, I don't think. Look at the Planning Commission's website and have a look.
At least a couple of the representations do a really good job of discussing it, so have a look through them.
Because there's been a couple. When I first wrote the report, there was one that was ambiguous as to whether it overrode it or whether it was read in conjunction with it. They've reissued it and makes it very clear. So make sure you avail yourself of that resource. Okay, I put this up last week. Why am I putting it up again? Because last week you would have gone, oh God, another flowchart. So, I like flowcharts. Is there anything out of here which is, to remind you, the normal process of a development application through council? Is there anything out of here you don't understand or doesn't make sense or you've got questions about? It starts with lodgement and it ends with decision, and it ends with, and it goes through a council decision and it ends in an appeal. This is the process our assessment task 3 actually went through. Okay, to recap. I lodge an application, this is a 30-second Cook's tour of this to remind you, for those that are too embarrassed to ask questions. And don't feel bad, I was at a leadership forum earlier today and where MD asked questions and people didn't put their hand up and I did, and like, for God's sake, they've been here 15 years and they're still embarrassed to ask a question. So, if I lodge an application and I don't have all of the required documentation under the legislation, i.e. owner's consent if it involves Crown land, I don't have an application. I have a collection of documentation that's not yet complete. Once I have all of the minimum required documentation and pay the fees, I have an application and this starts. The go button gets hit. I have 21 days to ask for more information. You'll see in the background documentation for assessment task 3, we asked for more information. When we received it, we advertised it. People made representations during the advertising period. So the notice on the site, the letter to adjoining landowners and occupiers, and the notice in the paper constituted advertising. It was a discretionary application. We wrote a recommendation and went to council. Council made a decision to refuse it. The applicant was notified. They lodged an appeal. We went to the tribunal. The tribunal's process is that they'll go through the opportunity for mediation, and in this case, on-site mediation. At the preliminary hearing, they said, can we meet on site, talk about it? Yep, great idea. We all met on site. The applicant or the representative of the applicant talked to council's legal representative and myself, talked to the tribunal, talked to the neighbours, had a bit of a thought and decided to withdraw the appeal. It went through that process. There's nothing secretive about it. The only thing being is time frames are set up that if council gets them wrong, they can be held accountable. No other decision-making authority under legislation in Tasmania can be held accountable in the same way, because there's no penalties against the other. The tribunal have 3 months to make the decision. They can get extended by an administrator. That's great. But there's nothing to say what happens if I exceed my 3 months. The decision doesn't become invalid. There's, maybe if someone went to the federal court, they might be able to argue something, I'm not sure. I've never seen it happen. there's the commission when they're hearing rezonings. It's as soon as practicable and as soon as reasonable are their processes. The NPA under MCA says you have 21 days to respond, but there's nothing to say what happens if you don't apply. So, council, excuse the terminology, but they're the whipping boy from a decision-making and development assessment process perspective. And you can bet if you miss one thing, someone will pick it up. I bet half of you have either been subject to an unfortunate event or seen it. And yes, I've buggered up before. I've missed advertising. I've, missed the 42-day period. I've gone cap in hand to the applicant and said, I'm very, very sorry. I buggered up. I haven't written the report and it's got to go to this council meeting and it's past the 42 days, or that decision will be past the 42 days. Can I have an extension?
If they do take it to tribunal, because you've left it too long, if they do take it to tribunal, are you responsible for their costs automatically?
You can be. They can apply.
Not automatically.
Well, they can apply and it's automatically approved. The issue is, are those costs reasonable or not? So, the tribunal won't award, like I can't go and now employ 85 QCs, tribunal sorry, it's a bit excessive. But I can employ a high-paid lawyer, and I can employ a visual consultant, and I can employ a landscape consultant, and I can employ an ecologist. If they need to give evidence, if it's relevant, and the tribunal are likely to go, yep, that's reasonable. And then I've got to pay to defend the council's position. So it can be a substantial penalty from a financial perspective.
But if council hasn't made a decision, if it's just the time has lapsed.
Yeah, same thing. That's the trigger, a deemed approval. If council's made the decision, all fair and reasonable, and the applicant appeals it, unless there's a particular aspect that's considered unreasonable or vexatious and frivolous, the default position is all parties pay for themselves. But as Jared will tell you, he's got a book this thick as to how to assign costs if costs are awarded at tribunals because of certain activities. It's a great question to ask Jared, and tell him that I told you to ask him. But from a practical perspective, I've seen it happen a couple of times. Most of the time, especially if there's nothing wrong with it, if you're going to approve it, the applicant's going to go, well, I can wait for you to not make a decision, and then I've got 14 days, then I have to appeal, then I have to go to a preliminary hearing 2.5, 3 weeks later, then I have to go to a full hearing and make a case, and then 3 months later I get a decision, or I could wait a week and you give me my approval. Yeah. There's a practical element to it.
This might be a good time for me to mention, I went to the commission on Monday. I had a great time.
Did you lose?
Well, it was the hearing about the Buddhist Cultural Park, I think it's called. And so there were only 2 representations against that, and one of the people was there. And he made the point, I run a quarry, I run a farm, my wife's sick, I want the commission to do this properly, I want this resolved now, I don't want to end up in the tribunal, I can't afford it. So. But
he can't go to the tribunal from the commission.
Well, it was...
failure to enforce a permit condition.
Yeah. So there was a tricky land use potential conflict between what was happening on the cultural park site, which was a lot of quiet contemplation, and there's a library being proposed, and the quarry, and sometimes when he's crushing, it's really noisy. So he was justifiably worried about how all that was going to be managed. He didn't have confidence that the commission was going to get the wording right, and that was happening on Tuesday, didn't go on Tuesday. But it was really interesting to see all this happen in real life, this person whose livelihood was potentially going to be affected by this rezoning, and how the chair, who's Sandra Hogan, who you'll meet when we go to the commission in a few weeks' time, how she dealt with all of that. It was I really encourage you to get along to either tribunal or a commission hearing for real, because it's a great experience.
Okay. I think I mentioned this earlier in one of the earlier slides about making sure we get the time calculations correct. I'm not going to read it, I hate reading slides. There's one thing you really need to know. Acts Interpretation Act gives some guidance with how you reckon time. So we say about 14 days and 42 days and 21 days from. There's some guidance in that act. It says that, you start on the next day if it says from, and if you finish on a public holiday, it goes the next day, etc. Great. Unless you're is there such a word as someone who absolutely enjoys legislation, other than complete nutter? Oh, lawyer, that's right. It's kind of like redundancy, isn't it? Unless you really love this stuff, until you get to council, you probably don't need it. Sometimes if you're writing a representation or writing an application, it's worth knowing this and knowing where to look. So the other point I want to make on this is, in every jurisdiction there is a reckoning of time calculation somewhere. Because every jurisdiction talks about on or at or from. There will be something in the legislation or guidance in the legislation somewhere which tells you how to calculate time. This is the Tasmanian version. Again, I'm not going to read it in detail. When I notify, there are different requirements of notification for different processes. For a DA, it's in our regulations of the land use planning. So it's the land use planning and approvals regulations. And it talks about what constitutes advertising, as we said, notice on the boundary, letter to the owners and occupiers of adjoining land, and notice in the paper. It describes it in the regulations. When you can't sleep, read them. You will go to sleep. I suppose it's actually worth pointing out. Other point I'll make this, and I do this a lot walking back here. There is a real risk if you step over and above this as council. It's not in a size not less than A4. If I'm council, I think I'm going to use A3 so it's easy for people to use. Clarence uses A3. So this is something Clarence has done. So it's nice and big wording, people can see it, they don't have to go and read it like this, because Hobart have one about the size of this. No, they use an A4, but they seem to have really small writing on it. If you do it consistently, it becomes the norm. And people can show that if you decide to suddenly change back to A4, you're not complying with that, because you've set an expectation from consistent action. And there's a lot of case law about that, but certainly from a Clarence perspective, it was a risk we knew we run, and it was our standard practice is we use A3. Now it might seem minor, but if you've got to know this because you're making a representation, if you're acting on behalf of someone who wants to lodge an appeal, you should be looking at all of these aspects. And of course, the notice in the paper. Emma, you showed one of these in the first week as an example. I think it was for the university's temporary accommodation. Here's one for, 78 Gilston Bay Road. Who the applicant was, what the proposal was for, relevant information, etc. So that's what went in the paper at the time of the...
That's interesting. The applicant was PDS surveyors. So they're...
Not Lex, no.
Not Lex, yes. We know that he's not in this particular case, but just to remind people, particularly the surveying students, that we have a senior surveyor who works for PDS surveyors coming in 2 weeks' time. So.
And look, when I worked at council, I know a lot of these guys, I worked with them a lot. We did They did lots of applications, you know, they'd come in, we had a really good working relationship. It was something I seem to have more, surveyors seem to be more regular customers, and so, you know, they worked out very easily. Be nice to the planners are nice to me, everything seems to run smoothly. If there's an issue, they'll ring me and talk to me. So, you know, it's worth thinking about if you end up working for someone like that. Of course, it can work against you if they've already got a bad relationship. Representation, we covered this before. So again, I'm just reminding you. LUPA defines a representation. So the Land Use Planning Approvals Act defines what is a representation. This is the important one. Includes a written statement of facts or reasons in support or in opposition to the draft. I hate it. That's not a statement of facts or reasons. Yeah. I don't sign it. Yeah. While we would report to council, there was 15 representations and 3 unsigned representations. So, you know, it needs to be very clear what the application you're talking about, what your issues are, whether you're in support or in opposition, etc. And then the right of representation is provided under the Act as well. Any person, there's a definition of person as to what constitutes a person as well. You need to know about that. The tribunal have made some decisions about that, particularly unincorporated public, you know, friends of the park that's just about to be bulldozed may not be a person, a legal person under law. Make a representation relating the application during a period of 14 days commencing on the date which the notice was given. That is, notice comprises 3 parts, on which the last part was achieved is the day notice was given. If I stick up the notice and I send out the letters on the Monday and it doesn't go out in paper until the Saturday, Saturday is the date notice is given. But of course, if I put the wrong thing on the notice because I thought it was going to be Wednesday, not Saturday, I've got to do the whole thing again. And of course, if I receive representations, like what happened in this case, before it was re-advertised, I then had to write to they had to write to the representors to say, we got the advertising wrong, do you wish your representation to be considered? We had to have basically an email or a letter saying, yes, please refer to my previous letter as a representation. Again, reading the legislation can be fun. Okay, I think I've got 2 more slides. Sorry, any questions out of that? Other than, what am I doing here? Yep. As I might have told you before, when I was doing my original master's degree years ago, one of our lawyer barristers around town helped deliver the course and sat down and we went through LUPA line by line. It was possibly the most boring lecture I've ever sat through in my life.
You're not very useful, surely.
Well, I didn't think it was. I'm sure Don had a different opinion, but it wasn't helpful. You're much better reading it for a purpose to understand, does this example comply, and it becomes a lot more clear. Okay, statutory referrals. Why have I got them in here? There is no referrals under LUPA. The referrals are from other legislation that refer back to LUPA. LUPA under section 60 used to have a bunch of referrals which were sunsetted out somewhere in about 1998 or something like that, and was meant to be replaced with state planning policies, which were meant to take that function of providing a high level advice. Other jurisdictions, notably Victoria, has a really strong referral process. Victoria, if you look at the planning scheme, it has a section about referrals, and it's like, am I doing this? Here's who I refer to, and it's pages long. So we're kind of an unusual case that we don't have really clear referrals.
So
In an application, if you're asking for more information, are you implying that you're referring them to other authorities?
Normally these people will ask if they want you to ask for more information because you're sending it to them early. So a really good one is EPA. You're not, it's all controlled under MCA. You can't advertise until you've referred it to them and they've got back to you to say, no, we don't want to deal with it, so you deal with it. Yes, we want to deal with it, but we don't have any further information, or yes, we want to deal with it and we want you to ask for this. So it's very important. And this comes back to also about the customer service. Trying to help people so they get one set of questions at the same time and it's all very clear and you don't have conflicts and you're trying to help them through the process even if the outcome is no. Other things, particularly if they're neighbouring properties, this is quite important. If I'm on a state road, send it to state growth, they have an opinion because they have a vested interest being access onto their road, particularly if it's a limited access road. They may not grant a licence for access. So it's nice to know about that early so you can talk to the applicant early in the process before we get to it, making a decision. Crown Land Services, quite often they've got internal processes to make decisions. Conservation assessment plans, not absolutely required, but often is important to get their comment. We used to refer to a lot of these and say, whilst you're not a formal referral body, we're interested if you have a comment. And they were treated as a representation. Again, trying to get the information that I can give as informed advice to the applicant as possible. I'll actually mention again, in Victoria, the statutory referrals are quite interesting because I can either lodge the application and go through a formal referral process, or I can go to the department or whoever and talk to them and get a written advice from them that they're happy with it or they want this or A, B and C and include that in my application. So I can either go through council, you do it, or I've already done it, and it's both processes are valid. When I make applications in Victoria, I said, well, you can do it, it's easier. I talk to, say, Melbourne Water and that to find out what's going on, but I'll let council deal with the statutory process of referrals. Okay, this is the second last slide, sorry. Or third last one to cut. Writing for decision makers. Now, is this important? I could ask, do you think this is important? Of course it's important. Why? And something very strange happens when you start writing an agenda for council when you're a planner. All of a sudden you think you're writing for the ages. And you use words like for so much and notwithstanding, and you write sentences that are this long and you try to read them out loud and you get halfway through and lose your breath. For some reason, we think we have to use very, very formal language, and it's not true. And the key thing when I was working at council, when I was having to do all the reviews of the agendas before they got published, was who am I writing for? Who's my prime audience? Now, I could be writing a letter to Mrs. Smith, Mr. Smith, who's written a letter to me asking something for their audience. I could be writing something back to the Ombudsman, I could be writing something to a minister, I could be writing a press release, I could be writing an agenda item. All of these things I was involved in council, and if you work as a planner at council, you will too. Who is my audience? As an agenda item, my prime audience is the alderman. There are not many, if any, aldermen in Tasmania who are planners. Which means we get back to the original thing. Establishing common language, understanding prior knowledge. So I need to write in a way that they're going to understand. And it's unambiguous what I mean. I used to use a technique and I've said before, planners are the worst people for jargon. Absolutely the worst. We write in more jargon. You hear me talking, EMCA does this and Looper does this and this is done under log bump and you think that's bad. Imagine if you had no idea about planning. I used to write agendas sometimes and take them up to someone at the other end of council, say someone that works in parks, and say, can you read that? Does that make sense? They look at me and go, right, I've got it wrong. I haven't written from a target audience. What am I writing for? People who have an interest. In Australia, most people are reasonably well educated, but that's not always going to be the case. And they normally are not technically minded, as in don't have a technical background in any of the issues discussed. Now, of course, you could have an engineer, and if you're talking about an engineering issue, they'll get it, but the other 11 won't. So I'm trying to write in a way that everyone can understand. What's that similar to? Newspaper. I think they talk about newspaper being targeted at about a 13-year-old, 14-year-old understanding level. It's probably about what I should write at. Short sentences, plain English, simple words. If I'm using jargon, explain it. If I'm talking about a detailed concept, explain it. Who am I in providing advice is another thing. So am I writing as on behalf of council? Am I writing on me? Am I providing advice as a qualified person under legislation to council? What's my role in writing this? So, case in council, I would write on behalf of someone else. So you actually had to think about, I better not, drop them into it by saying things poorly or writing something that they didn't agree with. Another matter is what other audience may be involved. If I'm writing a council agenda, it's a public document. It will be on the website, can be searched, and there will be my name against it. If I'm writing a proof of evidence to the tribunal. So there's another one here. I'm acting as an expert planner, independent of council, even though I'm employed by council. So, in my thing I don't say, Emma Farrow wrote a representation and she's a complete nut. And, we should completely and utterly ignore her. And, by the way, her house is ugly as well. She might get upset and sue me, sue council. So, I've got to make sure what I'm saying is reasonable as well, considering the audience. And also, I put this one in, your legal and moral implications or obligations. So, talking to educating our decision makers about what you can only make a decision within these confines. You have the ability to approve with conditions or refuse. If you refuse, you have to have reasons detailing your refusal, the basis for your refusal. So you're educating them. And I believe we have a moral obligation. Not all councils or statutory authorities agree with me, but if I'm writing an approval, I believe I should be saying, here's all the things that, this is approved subject to these conditions. By the way, you also should know this. You might need a permit under threatened species legislation. You might need a works permit from the state government. You might also need these other things. Here's who to contact and who to discuss about these things. So I'm actually providing extra customer service.
So
I don't have to. I've got no role in it.
So it doesn't come back to you, so council doesn't deal with the threatened
No,
species
in theory,
yeah.
I could write a assessment and say, they've said that this will impact upon the swift parrot, and this is relevant to this. Therefore, we should approve it because we don't think it's an issue. And completely and utterly ignore the fact, well, actually, swift parrot's a bad one. Let's say we're digging up some chocolate letters or something else that's listed at state level. And I say in my report, for as much as it's important to council under council's provisions, it's fine. And I completely and utterly ignore the fact that you need a permit from the threatened species unit. So you go there, great, and start to build, and the neighbour complains, and they come and they take you to task. Okay? Now, example's a poor one, but you know, the idea being that it's your responsibility to understand all of those other things you need a permit for, because council's only dealing with their role under legislation. I believe I have a moral obligation to let you know the things I know. Not everyone agrees with me, but you know, this comes down to who I want to be and how I want to treat you. There's probably other ones that if in my process of discovery I find something, other examples. I come across a caveat. Council's not a part of a covenant on the title. Council's not a party to it, doesn't enforce it. But I ring you up, how much John, come in and talk about your application. I found this could be a real issue for you. Do you want to put this on hold while you solve it with your lawyer? Because it might be a problem later on. You don't want to go through all this time and expense and then find out the problem. You know? But it's nothing to do with council. I'm just trying to be a good person. So I think there's a moral obligation. And of course involved in that is ethics. If you're a member of the Institute, then you have an ethical consideration. If you're a member of most institutes or formal organisations, you'll have a ethics policy and procedures that you need to comply with. We mentioned the other day about a particular case a few years ago in Victoria where there was a relationship between a developer and a council's planning officer, and there was brought to light, and there was a lot of problems with council's decision making. There was also some problems with the ethical issue as a professional planner under the Institute, because I was involved in the Institute. And it came up at one of our conferences about this particular example. So you could tack moral and ethical obligations. And of course that goes the other way. I find out something and I think I might need to talk to council and let them know. This is happening, it's none of your business, but you need to know this so that you don't step in. The tribunal will also impose that on you. Jared will talk about it. If you're acting as an expert witness in the tribunal, your obligation is to the tribunal, not to your employer. And it's a bit of an issue, you know. If I'm a council officer and I'm a planner and I'm turning up as council's expert planner, and I've got to go into conference with the other expert witnesses and agree on a set of agreed facts or whatever, I'm acting as a planning professional, not as a council advocate. So it's
I guess that's particularly relevant with something like Malvina, where the council plan has come out and said approve this, and the council's opted to reject it. So when it comes to tribunal, I guess that they have you to come out and.
When I was at Clarence, we had a real issue that if I recommended a refusal and council approved it, decided not to go with my recommendation, I wouldn't represent council at the hearing. Because all they had to do was say, as an expert planner, do you think this is a good idea? Sorry, I recommend a refusal. So of course it's going to put council on the pump. You know, so that's a real issue where the planner said one thing, council said another. You know, and it puts you between, I think as Marcus Spiller once said, between a dog and a child. So if you're involved in Lake Malvina and you're in any part of it, I think the advice is keep your mouth shut. If you're in the code, keep your mouth shut. And just do what you have to do. Of course, unless you're a representative, and then you can say whatever you want. Last slide, that is worth anything. Just remember, in all those discussions, we're talking about this. at the DA level. Why? Because it's 99.9% of the applications. But there are decision makers in other processes. Tribunal with appeals, special panels under our projects of regional significance, or our new major projects legislation when it happens, if it happens. Tasmanian Planning Commission for any amendments to the planning scheme and any combined DA and amendment processes. Parliament with regard to projects of state significance. If you're in other jurisdictions, there'll be others, but essentially you've got, I suppose I probably should have put the EPA in there as well, because the EPA have a decision-making role. In all jurisdictions, you'll have a local approval body, a state-level approval body, an EPA-type approval body, ministerial approval process, whether they do it through a special panel or themselves. Well, there are these processes. You've just got to ask yourself a question and find out what they are. I think I've probably covered this before. So, what advice can you provide and not provide? I think this is right back to your question, Hafey, and this is why I knew I had something on it. The key issue is you can't tell someone what council's going to do. Emma said, oh, I want to do an upstairs extension. Will it be approved? No. Mate, you lodge an application, it's going to be advertised. Will you approve it? Don't know. I can tell you what my process is, I can tell you the fees, I can tell you who the decision-making authority is, I can tell you that I'm going to write a representation. I'm going to write the recommendation, but I can't tell you what council's outcome will be. Council can't tell you what their outcome will be until they go through the formal decision-making process. However, when you have done it long enough, someone walks in the door and says, I want to do this, within 5 minutes I could tell you what my recommendation is likely to be qualified. It's either going to be, that looks reasonable, someone would need to raise something I can't think about or haven't noticed for me to change my mind, i.e. all of a sudden we discover that there's a particular threatened species on site which has overriding importance and wasn't, clear at the start, or no, that seems to be problematic, you'll need to do a lot of work to convince me it's reasonable. And I think most people can't, well, because most applications are fairly different in extremes. There's a few, of course, that will sit right in the grey line in the middle, which could go either way. But irrespective of that, I still only could say, I think it's the greatest proposal I've ever seen, but I'm only writing the recommendation. Council may dislike it. You have the right to speak your own when you can ask to be heard at the meeting. Your neighbours can do the same thing. Anyone else wants to can do the same thing. Council make a decision. They're bound by the legislation. If not, they don't comply with the confines of their decision-making process, you can go to the tribunal. You can ask them to review it. I can give you all that information, but none of that commits me to a decision. Any other questions on that? Concerns? Do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing that you can't tell you what's going to be approved? If you remember my thing about the major projects legislation, they're wanting what's essentially an approval in principle early on in the process. Oh yeah, that looks reasonable, tick. Or no, it's not, can't go any further. So it's an interesting process that will be as to how you move forward. Okay, that's it. Assessment task 2 is due on... The 3 is due on... What did we say?
30th this month. Right. End of the month.
I've got it here.
Which is why...
Tuesday, 30th of April, 11 p.m.
Yeah. why we're trying to get the representations marked so that we can de-identify them and give them to you, because there will be at least 38 of them and some of them are 12 pages long.
So don't wait till you get to 38, start now. There's lots you can do on the application itself before you have to worry about the issues raised by representation. When this so you've got to lodge electronically, yes. Milo records the time things are lodged. If you look up, you'd outline there's academic penalties for late submissions. But just because you're going to be a day late, don't not submit.
I think everyone handed in on time except for the women just did the rule, so that was good.
And I think what's the academic penalty? 2% per.
It's actually 5.
5%
per day for masters work. Yeah,
So it means you've got 10 days before it's an automatic fail.
Okay, that's it for
That's
today. We'll hang around. Oh, we've only got 5 more minutes in case anybody's got any questions. Otherwise, I will see you all online.